So when 2020 began, I didn't know that what I needed in my life was a story about lesbian necromancers in space, solving murders and setting off on a quest. You know who knew that? The internet. Everywhere I turned around, whether it was on Twitter or Instagram or YouTube, everyone kept telling me about this book called Gideon the Ninth, and I am very susceptible when it comes to books and advertising. So I was like, sure, I'll get it. And I'm so glad that I did, because this is one of the freshest voices in fantasy, or in fact in any genre that I have read for a long time. Now, this is a fairly new book, even though the second book of the series comes out later this year. So, not being a total monster, I'm going to divide this review up into two parts, and I'll let you know when the spoilery bits begin. So, the world of Gideon the Ninth is one of necromancy, and for those of you who don't know what that means, it means an entire world that's dedicated to raising people from the dead. And even within this world, Gideon belongs to this planet that's called the Ninth House, which is part of the 9 houses of this fantastical space empire. And as Gideon comes to know even the other houses and the other parts of the empire, as weird and wonderful as they are, even they think Gideon's 9th house is super weird. Now, Gideon, we don't really know where she's from or her history. We just know what she knows, which is that at some point in the past, this space vessel sort of crash landed on the planet of the 9th house, and in it was a woman who had just died and her brand new baby. Being as they are necromancers, they tried to talk to the ghost of the woman to find out where she came from and where this baby belonged, but she wouldn't tell them anything, and she just screamed Gideon at them before she vanished. And so Gideon is an orphan, and she's named Gideon because, you know, the people who were trying to talk to the ghost of her mom thought that maybe that's what her mom just wanted to call her. And her entire life has been spent on this planet that is pretty grim. And what's interesting about how Tamsyn Muir, the author, structures this world is that it's obviously a world that's very dark and scary, because there's skeletons walking everywhere, there's disembodied bones, and there's an entire race of people whose entire life revolves around death. But even within that, the idea is that Gideon isn't so much turned off or afraid of the dark, where she spent her entire life, or death. She's basically lonely. All she craves is human contact, and she doesn't care how or where she gets it. Most of her human contact comes from her fighting. And the author manages to make you think about this character who is so alone and who is so starved for any kind of human contact that she would rather fight people just for that moment of connection than save herself and keep to herself. So it's this really interesting layered psychology between the world in which these characters live and Gideon herself. Gideon also has a deep and complicated relationship with Harrow, who is the head of the house to which Gideon belongs. And Harrow is kind of like Wednesday Addams, all grown up and even more screwed up. Harrow is the smartest person in the room, and everybody knows it because she does not care to hide it. Harrow's a survivor just as Gideon is a survivor, and there's a lot of things about the two women that sort of mirror each other. So Harrow is a creature of the mind, but Gideon is a creature of reflexes and the body. And it's really fascinating to see the two of them spar and work off each other and work with each other at a certain point. Now, a lot of people will tell you that this book is love it or hate it, and it's true. In most genre novels, and this is not just a fantasy thing, I think this is for every genre, the conventions of the genre don't always work with voices that are too distinct. The average genre reader, when they pick up a book, They want to be immersed in the world, and they find it easier when the voice itself isn't too distinct or too funny or too quippy. And Muir definitely has a voice. For some people, it's going to work really well. It sort of harkens back to internet speak almost. I don't mean like she has emojis and stuff, but she has this very sarcastic, humorous way of dealing with very dark and grim subjects. In a way, she kind of reminds me of Terry Pratchett in the way she uses humor. Now, this doesn't mean that if you're a Pratchett fan, then this is going to be the exact kind of humor that Pratchett used. So don't go out there and be like, oh yeah, Amrita told me that I'd enjoy this because this book is exactly like Terry Pratchett. That is not what Amrita said. That is not what Amrita meant to say. This is not Terry Pratchett's humor at all. But what Muir does is that she uses her voice and the distinctness or the distinctiveness of her voice in the same way that Pratchett does, in that it is inextricable from the world that she is building. So for example, in the beginning of the story, when Gideon and Harrow are part of this cohort who have been gathered on this one particular planet in order to solve this quest, and nobody really knows how they're going to do it or what it even is. And because the Ninth are seen as cultists in this world, they have a lot of mixed reactions from their fellow peers. Wait, fellow peers? But you know what I mean. So basically, there's a scene where Gideon has just been insulted by somebody to her face in this very, polite, old school kind of way that is very antithetical to who Gideon is. And Gideon is forced to not respond due to other reasons. And so all you have is her inner monologue. And there's this bit where she's looking at this guy and she's insulted, but she can't do anything about it. And she's also kind of let down because she thought that they were going to have a fight, and instead he just said things to her, which Gideon is very sticks and stones kind of person. And she has this inner monologue where she goes, why do you have a baby uncle? Why is it the color of mayonnaise? And then she kind of like walks away without showing anything on her face, and it is hilarious. So for example, there's this scene where Gideon has found out that she might have inadvertently come in between two people who loved each other. And it's this very emotional moment where a number of really terrible things have already happened, and Gideon is in the process of coming to terms with several things and ideas that are very foreign to her because she's actually a very young woman. And she's oddly sheltered because she's lived her entire life in the Ninth and she doesn't know anything about the world at large. And in any other novel, there would be this horrible sort of sentimentality and everybody would have been like really devastated. And Gideon is devastated. But what comes out of her mouth is, oh God, why am I so attractive? And then Harrow looks at her and says, because otherwise they'd have killed you within 5 seconds of meeting you. Now, I think that's hilarious, but there are people out there who might find that too quippy, who might think that's too glib, all the things that they say about humor on the internet. So if you're a person who goes on Reddit or who goes on Twitter and thinks like some of those threads are funny, then this is the book for you. But if you're somebody who likes to sort of indulge in the emotions and who wants a bit more sincerity than one can find online, then maybe this book isn't for you. This book also has amazing action scenes. So Muir apparently worked with a sword master. I don't know what you call a person who's really good at swords, but she's from New Zealand. So I guess there are like people who really specialize in swords, and that's why we had Lord of the Rings set there, I guess. Or maybe this person was just, I don't know, maybe they taught swords on the set. I don't know what's up, dudes, but she worked with somebody who really knew what they were doing, and you can see the effect of that in these books, or in this book, because I haven't read the other one as yet. I also love the world building in this book because it is both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. So what Muir does is that she takes conventions that are very familiar to fantasy fans, and then she uses them in ways that are very unexpected. So one tiny example, without going into spoilers, would be that Gideon is clearly a savant, as is Harrow for that matter, but Gideon is the person who's the main point of view throughout this book. And she's a very old school fantasy savant in that she is incredibly good at sword fighting, and everybody knows it. And she's constantly surprising the people around her, and they all have this moment where they're just like, oh my god, you're awesome. And then Gideon, who's very young emotionally and very sheltered, like I said before, is just like, wait, me? Moi? I'm awesome? And it's all very nice, and it speaks to places in my heart that are very dear to me. But at the same time, she is not the person who is the primary person on the quest. That would be Harrow. So you have all these different threads that are coming together. And so now I'm going to move into the spoiler section. So the main quest in this book belongs to Harrow, who is the head of the house and is chosen to serve the emperor at the end of the book. And to make that happen, Gideon needs to sacrifice herself. But here's the thing, when that happens, we are told by everybody around both Harrow and Gideon that Gideon has died. But the way Muir writes it is so ambiguous, and because we have gone through this entire journey with Gideon, and we've seen her fight for survival, and we've seen her come back from situations where she really shouldn't have. And we know that this is a character who has grown up surrounded by death, but who wants life more than any other character that you have ever read. And because her body is missing at the very end, and you don't really know the history of Gideon, like where did she come from, and does she have any powers? Like, how does she fit into this mosaic other than the fact that she helped Harrow achieve her aims? So there's a part of you that doesn't want to believe that Gideon is dead. And it also ends with Harrow being like, she's going to go back and find out what happened to Gideon. So you have that to look forward to. That being said, however, I would have nothing but respect for Muir if she chooses to just let that thread dangle. Because keep in mind, we don't know where Gideon came from, but there's a big song and dance about it. Okay, it's not a big song and dance, but it's mentioned as something that is very pertinent to the story. But sometimes there are certain threads that are very important, but they don't eventually get folded into the master weave. So maybe this is just a part of Gideon's life, and now Gideon is dead, and we'll never find out any different. And that would be a very brave and interesting choice for Muir to make. And because this is her debut novel and I don't know anything else about her, I don't know if that's the kind of writer she is. However, I do hope that that's not how she goes, and then she chooses to do something a little bit more conventional, which is that we will run into Gideon or Gideon's backstory in later novels. So the next book is coming out this year, and it's called Harrow the Ninth. And then there's going to be one more novel because it's a trilogy. And I have fallen in love with Gideon like wholeheartedly. So I really want to know what happened. How did Gideon end up on the ninth? And how is Harrow going to deal with all the craziness that is in wait for her? And what's up with the Emperor? Because I know that dude is sketch. If you're looking for something that's like truly funny and different, I highly recommend Gideon the Ninth. I don't think the world is too disturbing or anything. I mean, yes, it has necromancers and things, but the hallmark of a great writer is that they can build a story in the most unlikeliest of settings. And I feel like Muir is a talent to really look out for because she really knocks it out of the park. I am going to be so upset if Harrow the Ninth sucks. For more videos, please hit the subscribe button.